Ladies and gentlemen, friends who have gathered not to be entertained but to be gently lulled, allow me to take you on a very slow, meandering walk through the dusty corridors of history, where the candles are dim, the footsteps echo too loudly, and the stories are sometimes so dull and peculiar that they become strangely soothing. Tonight, we are not here to be thrilled by tales of warriors or dazzled by the brilliance of kings and queens. Instead, we are here to drift, to wander, to almost nod off as we explore the little oddities of what people once thought was fun, especially in the medieval world, and even beyond. History is not always about battles and inventions. Sometimes it is about the strange, the quiet, the repetitive, and the peculiar things humans chose to do with their time, things that seem so curious to us now that they almost feel dreamlike. Imagine, if you will, the medieval town square. It is not filled with flashing lights or bustling cars, but with wooden stalls, the smell of hay, and the slow sound of people gathering. Entertainment in those times was not a glowing screen or a catchy tune on the radio, but rather things that to us may feel boring or even baffling. For example, one of the most common entertainments was watching animals fight. Bears would be chained, dogs would be unleashed, and crowds would gather for hours, not minutes, just to see who would tire out first. This was not a brief pastime but a long, drawn-out affair. People would place bets, not on how quickly it ended, but on how long it dragged on. Time seemed to stretch, and the slow pace of the fight was the entertainment itself. Then there was the medieval fascination with tournaments. Of course, when we think of knights, we imagine exciting clashes of lances and shining armor. But what we forget is that these tournaments could last days, sometimes weeks, with long breaks, endless waiting, and long stretches where very little happened. The crowd would sit, sometimes in silence, sometimes murmuring, while knights paraded slowly, carefully, endlessly. The actual moments of combat were brief, almost an afterthought. The bulk of the event was slow ceremony, preparation, and pauses. And yet people loved it. They loved the waiting, the build-up, the ritual. For us today, it would feel like waiting hours for a game that lasted only minutes. In towns and villages, one curious form of entertainment was the mystery play. Now, that sounds intriguing, but in reality, these plays were not short and snappy performances. They were long, sometimes lasting the entire day, with actors slowly reciting lines about biblical events, often performed in wagons that rolled from street to street. A play about the creation of the world might take hours just to cover the first few chapters of Genesis. Imagine sitting on a wooden bench, the sun in your eyes, with no intermission, no snacks, and no special effects, just the slow, steady droning of actors telling the stories in monotone voices. To the medieval audience, this was joyous. To us, it might feel like the perfect lullaby, an endless rhythm of words that never seemed to end. Speaking of strange fun, we cannot forget the pastime of watching public executions. It may seem dark to us now, but for medieval people, this was a day out, a community gathering. And while the act itself might have been quick, the waiting, the speeches, the processions, the endless build-up could take hours. People would stand and wait, sometimes all morning, just to witness something that would be over in moments. The entertainment was not in the event itself but in the waiting, the crowd, the anticipation. That slow rhythm of gathering and waiting was part of the medieval sense of fun. Even stranger, there were times when fun was not violent or dramatic at all, but oddly repetitive. Take, for example, the medieval practice of watching animals perform unusual tricks. Monkeys dressed in little outfits, bears made to dance, or trained dogs leaping through hoops. But the tricks were not fast-paced or dazzling like today's circus acts. They were slow, clumsy, awkward. A bear might take minutes just to move from one side of the square to the other, bowing its head or lifting a paw. The audience would laugh, not at something spectacular, but at the slowness, the awkwardness, the drawn-out spectacle of an animal being coaxed into doing something unnatural. It was strange, and it was considered fun. Board games also existed, but they were not always the quick-paced games we know today. Games like chess were seen as noble, intellectual pursuits, but matches could last for hours, even days. Imagine two lords sitting across from one another, barely moving, staring silently, occasionally adjusting a piece, while the entire hall waited, and waited, and waited. The entertainment was not in speed but in endurance, patience, and long concentration. A game was less about excitement and more about persistence, about who could last the longest without making a mistake. And then, in the quieter corners of medieval life, people found joy in things like embroidery, storytelling, and long songs. A ballad could last for dozens of verses, sung slowly, with no rush. An embroidery project might take months, with each tiny stitch carefully placed, while friends sat together chatting in hushed voices. Storytelling was not a quick bedtime tale but an entire evening of one story told in a slow, rhythmic voice, with long pauses, and sometimes tangents that wandered away from the main point. The story was not about where it was going but about the journey of listening itself. Outside the medieval period, humans still found curious ways to spend their time. In the Victorian era, for example, people enjoyed something called parlor games. Some of these sound fun, but many were bizarrely slow. One involved balancing cards or objects on one another until the stack toppled, which could take ages. Others involved staring contests, long silences, or guessing games that dragged on with endless clues. Families considered this delightful, while to us it might feel like the most boring evening imaginable. And yet, there is something almost comforting about that boredom, something lulling, something soft that lets the mind drift. One particularly odd pastime across many centuries was watching people eat. Banquets were not quick affairs. They stretched on for hours, sometimes an entire day, with course after course being brought out. Guests did not simply eat and leave. They sat, talked, waited, and picked at their food for what seemed like forever. Entertainment at these banquets was sometimes no more than listening to someone play a lute in the corner or recite a poem that went on, verse after verse, until guests had almost forgotten where it began. Fun, in this sense, was not about excitement but about slowness, about stretching time until it felt endless. In fact, stretching time seemed to be the essence of fun in the past. Walking in gardens was not a brisk exercise but a slow, deliberate stroll, sometimes for hours, without conversation, just admiring each plant. Watching the stars was not a quick glance at the sky but lying for entire nights, waiting, hoping to see a shooting star or to chart the movement of constellations. Reading was not a fast binge but a slow savoring, with people reading aloud to one another, word by word, sometimes stopping after only a few pages and saving the rest for another day. And then, there were the stranger amusements, ones that feel almost dreamlike to us now. In some villages, people entertained themselves by holding contests to see who could sit still the longest. Others enjoyed rolling cheeses down hills and chasing after them, which was less about the chase and more about the slow climb back up the hill afterward. There were even reports of people enjoying the sight of cats dressed in costumes or chickens with tiny boots. It was silly, yes, but also strangely monotonous, something to pass the time in worlds where time seemed endless. The truth is, much of human history is filled not with drama but with waiting, with repetition, with slowness. People found joy in things that stretched on, that seemed to never end. To us today, they might feel boring, even sleep-inducing, but to them, it was life, it was community, it was how time passed. And perhaps that is why, when we look back now, these stories of strange entertainment feel so perfect for lulling us into rest. They are not thrilling, they are not heart-racing. They are slow, gentle, and curious. They remind us that boredom has always been a part of life, and that sometimes, boredom is a kind of comfort. So as we close our wandering through these dusty corridors of history, let us remember that fun has not always meant excitement, that joy has not always meant speed. Sometimes fun was in the long pauses, the endless plays, the drawn-out games, the hours of waiting for something small to happen. And as you let your mind drift, perhaps these tales of slow, strange pastimes can carry you softly into rest, just as they carried entire generations before us through their long, slow days.